Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever wondered about the historical roots of the papacy? Beyond the familiar narratives we often hear. What if much of what we think we know about its origins actually developed much later than you might expect?
Right.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into an incredible source that challenges many common assumptions. The Papacy by Jean-Louis Guettet. It's a work that offers a truly fascinating and sometimes provocative look at how the authority of the Bishop of Rome has been understood, debated, and challenged throughout the centuries.
Indeed, and Guettet's work isn't some modern polemic, really. It's a meticulous historical and theological examination. He spends, well, centuries sifting through early Christian writings, the very words of Scripture, the decrees of ecumenical councils, to present a perspective that might genuinely surprise many listeners. Our mission today is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from this material, to see what Guettet argues was the original foundational understanding of church authority versus what later developed, and ultimately how those shifts led to pretty profound consequences in Christian history.
So get ready to re-examine some foundational beliefs. We'll be looking at what the earliest church fathers truly had to say, how major ecumenical councils handled authority, and how certain claims about papal power emerged over time, often through what Guettet characterizes as, well, deliberate shifts.
Exactly.
This deep dive is designed to give you some real aha moments, making you rethink common assumptions about one of the most enduring institutions in Western civilization. Guettet begins our journey by taking us straight to the foundational texts of Christianity itself, specifically the letters of St. Paul. He argues that Paul's writings lay out a blueprint for the church that fundamentally clashes with the later development of a centralized monarchical papacy. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verses 20 through 22, describes the church as a spiritual temple, a grand sacred edifice where the faithful are the very stones that make up this dwelling.
And here's where Guettet draws a very precise line. Paul unequivocally states that Jesus Christ himself is the chief cornerstone of this entire structure. There is absolutely no other foundation, no other principal stone mentioned in Paul's architectural metaphor for the church.
Okay.
What's critical for Guettet is that this means, from the very inception of Christian theology, the church is founded solely on Christ, not on any human figure. This isn't just like a casual metaphor for Guettet, it's a structural definition of the church.
So if Christ is the chief cornerstone, where do human leaders fit in? I mean, what about the apostles?
Well, that's exactly what Guettet emphasizes. He looks at Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 3:11, where Paul is even more explicit, declaring, "For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ." And this was a direct lesson, Guettet points out, for the early Corinthians, because some of them were becoming overly attached to specific preachers, like Paul himself, or Apollos, or even Cephas, who is Peter. Okay. So they were kind of making mini factions based on who they followed.
Precisely. They were starting to look to these human figures as if they were the cornerstones, the ultimate foundations of their faith communities. But Guettet highlights that Peter, along with all the other apostles, was merely a minister of Jesus Christ, as Paul puts it, or what Guettet calls a first layer of this mystic edifice.
Just the first layer, not the cornerstone itself.
Exactly. They were instrumental in laying the initial groundwork, spreading the gospel, establishing communities, but they were not the ultimate foundation or the cornerstone. This distinction is crucial because it immediately refutes, in Guettet's view, any idea of single human being, even Peter, serving as the ultimate, indispensable, and singular foundation upon which the entire church rests. It fundamentally underscores the collective nature of the apostolic ministry under Christ. So, what does this foundational understanding from Paul ultimately mean for later papal claims, which, assert a singular supreme authority?
Well, Guettet argues that if Christ is the sole and ultimate foundation, then any concept of a single human cornerstone or an absolute and infallible sovereign pontiff is profoundly absent from Paul's vision of the church. Paul consistently describes the church as a unified body, but with Christ as its singular head.
Right, the head of the body.
Composed of both pastors and faithful, all working together for the edifying of Christ's body, as you see detailed in Ephesians 4:11-16.
It's a very different picture from a monarchical structure, isn't it?
Completely different. Guettet concludes that in these foundational biblical notions of the church, there is simply no conceptual or theological room for a sovereign pontiff who is absolute and infallible. He points out that while the care of all the church was indeed committed to Peter in some sense, even Peter himself, in his own letters, did not call himself universal apostle. This humility and the collective nature of the apostles as ministers of Christ are central to Guettée's argument, serving as a fundamental interpretative lens. The original scriptural understanding, he contends, simply does not support the later developed papacy as an institution of universal supreme jurisdiction. It's a critical starting point for his historical exploration.
Okay, this brings us to perhaps the most cited verse in discussions about papal authority. Matthew 16:18, where Jesus famously says to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." This verse is often presented as the definitive biblical proof for the papacy.
The cornerstone text for many.
Exactly. But Guettée brings in powerful counter-arguments here, directly challenging the common Roman Catholic interpretation. How does Guettée interpret Matthew 16:18, if not as a direct endorsement of singular papal authority?
Well, Guettée doesn't just offer his own interpretation, which is key. He delves into the historical understanding of this verse among the early church fathers themselves. He cites Lannoy, a renowned doctor of the Sorbonne from the 17th century, known for his vast erudition and meticulous scholarship.
Okay, so a serious historical source.
Very much so. Lannoy's research meticulously showed that only a small number of fathers or doctors actually applied the rock exclusively to St. Peter. In fact, Lannoy found that most of them do not apply this to him at all, understanding Christ's words in quite a different manner.
That's a significant finding. Wow, it shifts the perspective from like a singular interpretation to a diversity of understanding within the early church. What were some of these different manners of interpretation then?
So the vast majority of the fathers, according to Guettée's sources, interpreted the rock not as Peter himself, but as Peter's confession of faith. You know, when he says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God."
Ah, so the rock is the faith Peter confessed.
Exactly. The church is built on this fundamental truth that Peter articulated. Others understood the rock to refer to Christ himself, seeing him as the ultimate foundation, just like we discussed from St. Paul.
Consistent with Paul then.
Right. And still others saw it as referring to all the apostles collectively, with Peter being maybe the first to make the confession, thus representing the entire apostolic body. This diverse patristic witness, for Guettée, undermines the later exclusive Roman interpretation that claims the rock only refers to Peter as a singular individual and the foundation of a perpetual monarchical office.
This is a powerful contrast, isn't it? If we connect this to the bigger picture, Guettée draws heavily on St. Cyprian, a pivotal early church father from the 3rd century. Cyprian, in his famous treatise on church unity, explicitly denies the primacy of St. Peter himself in the sense of a singular superior jurisdiction. How does Cyprian see Peter then, if not as a unique personal foundation for the papacy?
Cyprian views Peter not as an exclusive personal foundation, but as a type of unity, a symbol, if you will.
A type or symbol?
Yes. This unity, for Cyprian, actually resided in the Apostolic College as a whole, and by succession, in the whole episcopal body. Cyprian refers to this collective episcopate as the See of Peter.
The whole episcopal body is the See of Peter, not just Rome.
That's Guettée's point based on Cyprian. He contends that Roman theologians strangely distort Cyprian's meaning by interpreting the See of Peter as exclusively the See of Rome. Cyprian believed the powers promised to Peter were in fact given to all the apostles, underscoring the collective, shared nature of authority, not a singular monarchical one residing in Rome. For Cyprian, the legitimate episcopacy in general was the See of Peter, whether in Carthage, Rome, or Alexandria, or anywhere else. It was about shared responsibility, not singular rule.
And then there's Tertullian, another significant early voice. While some might quote him saying Peter was the rock of the church, Guettée notes that Tertullian elsewhere explains himself in a way that doesn't support a singular personal foundation for Peter.
Right, context is everything.
And even more tellingly, Tertullian engages in what Guettée calls ironic ridicule of titles like Sovereign Pontiff and Bishop of Bishops, when these were taken by Roman bishops like Zephyrinus and Callistus in the early 3rd century. What does this tell us?
It tells us that even in the early centuries, such grand overarching claims and pompous titles, as Guettée quotes, were not universally accepted. They were viewed with suspicion and even outright mockery by prominent theologians like Tertullian.
So he was being sarcastic.
Pretty much. Tertullian, a learned priest from Carthage, used sarcasm when referring to a Roman bishop as sovereign pontiff, that is, the bishop of bishops, in a passage criticizing the remission of sins. This wasn't an affirmation of the title, but rather a derisive comment, underscoring that such elevated language was seen as a mark of pride rather than a divinely instituted right.
Wow.
Guettée concludes that Rome cannot establish her pretended rights upon the testimony of these early figures without resorting to subterfuges as are unworthy of an honest cause, accusing Romanists of isolating words from their full context. This early skepticism, then, sets the stage for Guettée's core argument that the monarchical papacy was a later development, not an original institution.
So, if the scriptural foundation and the early church fathers don't seem to support a singular universal papacy, how did the Bishop of Rome actually function in the first few centuries? Guettée shifts our focus to historical facts from the first 3 centuries of the Church, demonstrating that the Bishop of Rome's influence was significant, yes, but it was based on the importance of his, not a recognized universal authority or jurisdiction.
Exactly. You have to imagine the early church not as this perfectly unified top-down hierarchy we might picture today, but more like a vibrant, sometimes quite contentious mosaic of local traditions and regional centers.
A bit messy, perhaps.
Definitely messy at times. Disputes over practices were common. Take the Easter controversy in the late 2nd century, involving Victor, Bishop of Rome. Eusebius, the early church historian, notes that Victor endeavored to cut off Asian churches over their differing date for celebrating Easter.
Endeavored, that word choice seems key.
It is key because, as Guettée explains, Victor simply lacked the inherent universal power to just issue a decree and have it automatically obeyed everywhere. He tried, but he couldn't just do it unilaterally.
And what was the response to Victor's attempt to impose his will? Did people just fall in line?
Not at all. Other bishops, like Irenaeus, who was hugely respected, strongly censured his conduct, urging him to promote peace, not division. They reasoned with him as equals in episcopal authority, recognizing only ancient tradition as the guiding rule. No one recognized universal authority in Victor.
So they pushed back.
They pushed back. Victor pronounced excommunication, but Guettée is clear. It remained but an attempt and had to be ratified by the other churches in order to be valid. This is a crucial point. A Roman bishop's pronouncements weren't automatically binding. They required the consent or agreement of other churches, highlighting a more conciliar, decentralized understanding of authority.
This raises an important question then. If not universal authority, what was the nature of the Bishop of Rome's influence? How did Rome become so prominent?
Right, because Rome clearly was influential. Guettée clarifies that Rome's influence did not arise in a universal authority, but was simply derived from the importance of his see. Rome was the capital of the empire, a vibrant hub, a natural link between East and West.
Location, location, location.
Partly, yes. Its strength as an apostolic church, believed to have been founded by Peter and Paul, was also bolstered by faithful from all over the world, bringing witness to Rome and seeking its support, its opinion. When figures like Origen or Dionysius of Alexandria communicated with Rome, it was seen as a duty of bishops to enlighten brothers, to share information, or seek mutual support.
Like colleagues consulting each other.
Exactly. Not an act of submission to a superior jurisdiction. It wasn't an appeal in the sense of a higher court for a binding verdict, but rather seeking advice, information, or solidarity, as bishops routinely did with each other across the major sees. For instance, when Dionysius of Alexandria sent a theological work to Rome to clarify his sentiments on doctrine, Guettée argues it was simply an imperative duty between bishops, not an exercise of authority by the Roman bishop over a subordinate.
Okay, that makes sense. Another key example Guettée uses is the heated dispute between Stephen, Bishop of Rome, and Saint Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, concerning the baptism of heretics in the mid-3rd century. Stephen declared he wouldn't communicate with Saint Cyprian and others who disagreed with his view on rebaptism. But, as Guettée points out, this was largely seen as a personal act of the Bishop of Rome. Why was that distinction so important?
Because the unity of the church, for Guettée, remained intact, despite Stephen's personal declaration. Why? Precisely because unity did not consist in an union with the Bishop of Rome as the sole ultimate arbiter.
So breaking communion with Rome didn't automatically mean you were out of the whole church?
Not according to the understanding Guettée presents from this period. Councils, not individual bishops acting alone, were seen as the proper authority for matters as grave as excommunication or defining doctrine for everyone. St. Dionysius of Alexandria, for instance, intervened directly to prevent Stephen from troubling the church further, treating his letter not as an authoritative decree to be instantly obeyed, but as an intervention that needed to be checked and reasoned with.
Interesting.
This clearly illustrates Getty's claim that early Roman excommunications were often personal acts or regional declarations without universal binding force unless ratified by broader consensus or a council.
And the Novatian Schism, a separate schism around the same time, seems to show similar dynamics regarding appeals to Rome, right?
Exactly. Getty critically examines the appeals made to Rome during this Novatian Schism. He argues that if such appeals were seen as proof of Rome's supremacy, then one could, quote, as fairly infer the supremacy of Carthage over Rome, given how St. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, actively intervened in relation to Rome.
So Carthage was influencing Rome too.
Yes, Cyprian, in fact, interfered to reestablish the order of the Church in Rome itself, influencing its affairs arguably more than Rome influenced Carthage in that particular period. Guettée underlines that when Cyprian praises the See of Peter, he is, in Guettée's view, referring to the legitimate episcopacy in general, the shared office held by all bishops, not solely the unique, singular See of Rome.
Back to that idea of the collective episcopate.
Right. Guettée asserts that later Roman theologians strangely distort Cyprian's meaning to suit their claims of a singular, superior jurisdiction residing solely in the Bishop of Rome, highlighting what he sees as a clear historical disconnect.
Okay, now let's turn to the pivotal ecumenical councils, which Guettée argues, far from confirming Roman supremacy, actually established hierarchical ranks based on political importance, limited the Bishop of Rome's role, and even, in one striking instance, condemned a pope as a heretic. These are monumental moments in church history, seen as the supreme legislative and doctrinal authorities for early Christianity.
Indeed. These councils are absolutely central to Guettée's argument. Let's start with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The very first ecumenical council, a gathering of bishops from across the Christian world, deciding huge issues of faith and discipline.
The big one.
The big one. Its famous Canon 6 established the authority of the Bishop of Alexandria over his entire region, explicitly stating this was based on custom, specifically, since that is also passed into a custom for the Bishop of Rome.
Wait, so it says Rome's authority was based on custom too?
That's exactly Guettée's reading. It implies Rome's authority, like Alexandria's, was rooted in established practice and custom, not some unique divine right or Petrine succession, giving it universal jurisdiction from the start. Guettée highlights that any additions found in later manuscripts claiming primacy of the Apostolic See for Rome are, in his analysis based on historical scholarship, forgeries from the Middle Ages, completely unknown in earlier authentic versions of the canon.
Wow, forgeries again.
That's a recurring theme in his analysis of how papal claims were bolstered later on. The original canon simply recognized existing regional practices, not a universal Roman supremacy.
So custom and political realities, not divine right, were the basis. How did the later councils build on this? Did they change course?
Not really. They seem to reinforce it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, the Second Ecumenical Council, clearly interpreted and expanded on Nicaea's principles. Its third canon granted the Bishop of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the new Rome, the primacy of honor after Rome.
Okay, second place, but why?
And it gave the explicit reason, because Constantinople is the new Rome. This was based on the principle that divisions of the empire were made the divisions of the church, demonstrating unequivocally that ecclesiastical rank followed civil importance, not an inherent divine succession unique to the Roman bishop.
Politics driving church structure.
That's what Guettée argues the historical record shows. And what's even more fascinating here, and crucial for Guettée's argument, is that this council was not convoked, presided over, or confirmed by the Bishop of Rome. Damasus, the Roman bishop at the time, didn't even send legates, and no Western bishop participated.
No Roman involvement at all.
None directly. Yet its dogmatic decrees were universally accepted and even revered by St. Gregory the Great in the 7th century, as if they were the Gospels themselves. This underscores its authority independent of Roman confirmation. It's a powerful counterpoint to claims of a singular, necessary Roman assent for ecumenical validity.
And the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, another monumental ecumenical council, seems to further solidify this pattern. Its 28th canon explicitly states that most justly did the fathers grant privileges to the see of the ancient Rome because she was the reigning capital city.
Right. It couldn't be clearer. The basis for Rome's privileges was its political status as the capital, and the very same basis was applied to Constantinople. The canon continues. Moved by the same motive, the council granted equal privileges to Constantinople.
Equal privileges? How did Rome react to that?
Not well. Pope Leo I's legates fiercely opposed this particular canon. They wanted Rome to retain a unique, supreme position, but the canon was nonetheless adopted by the council. The council merely asked Leo to honor our judgment by your own decrees, which Guettée interprets as a request for concord and respect, not a submission to a higher authority for confirmation, as if Leo had the power to invalidate their decision.
So they passed it anyway, despite Rome's
He
objection.
did. And in fact, Leo refused to admit this canon, yet it was universally accepted and adhered to in both East and West for centuries, further proving, for Guettée, the practical limits of Roman authority and the principle that ecumenical councils held supreme legislative authority in the early church.
But what about that famous phrase, Peter has spoken by Leo, which is often cited by Roman theologians in relation to Chalcedon? Doesn't that prove Leo's unique authority was recognized there?
Guettée dismisses this as mere honorary language, basically acclamation. He emphasizes that it's found in the midst of other exclamations during the council and shouldn't be taken in an ultramontane sense. That is the later view emphasizing the Pope's absolute authority above councils.
So more like high praise than a legal statement.
That's how Guettée reads it. And he points to St. Gregory the Great's later letters, written in the early 7th century, which reveal a really telling detail. The Council of Chalcedon offered the title ecumenical bishop to the Bishop of Rome as an honor to St. Peter.
They offered it.
Offered it, yes. But Gregory explicitly states, none of us has consented to use this particular title. This proves that Rome did not even then consider the title a right of divine succession. It was an offered honor, and one that Gregory actively refused because he saw it as arrogant and an affront to the equality of bishops. The fact that Leo refused Canon 28, yet it was universally admitted, further proves the practical limits of Roman authority.
And perhaps the most striking fact that Guettée presents, one that directly challenges later claims of papal infallibility, or that the Pope is above conciliar judgment, is the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680 AD. What happened there? This sounds important.
This is a monumental detail, something you won't easily forget if you're looking at this history. This council was convoked by Emperor Constantine Pogonatus and presided over by the emperor himself, not the Pope. Its primary task was to examine the letters of Sergius of Constantinople and Pope Honorius of Rome concerning the Monothelitic heresy, a complex theological debate about whether Christ had one or two wills.
Okay, a major doctrinal issue.
Absolutely. The council meticulously reviewed the evidence, including Pope Honorius's letters, and the verdict, explicitly, anathema to Honorius the heretic.
Wow. Anathema to a pope by an ecumenical council.
Directly. The council found his letter to Sergius authorizes his impious doctrine and formally expelled him from the church's list of recognized Orthodox bishops.
A sitting pope condemned as a heretic by an ecumenical council. That's astounding. What was the aftermath? Did Rome just ignore it?
No, quite the opposite. The historical record shows that Leo II, Honorius' successor as pope, formally concurred in this condemnation. He confirmed the council's decision in his own letters.
The next pope agreed his predecessor was a heretic.
He formally accepted the council's judgment, yes. This point is absolutely critical for Guettée's overall argument. It demonstrates unequivocally that conciliar authority was seen as supreme, even over a bishop of Rome, and that infallibility was certainly not a concept applied to individual popes at this early stage. Guettée highlights that this particular council was neither convoked nor presided over by the Bishop of Rome, even though papal legates were present. Its decision was canonical, and the Pope's own successor eventually submitted to it. This stands as, for Guettée, incontestable proof that the prerogatives now ascribed to the papacy-like infallibility and universal jurisdiction were unknown in the 6th century, even at Rome. It's a historical fact that fundamentally refutes the idea of an unbroken, divinely instituted monarchical papacy from the earliest times.
Okay, so having laid out the earlier centuries where Roman authority was based on custom and political importance and councils were supreme, Guettée now pinpoints a critical turning point. He makes a profound historical assertion. Adrian I, who reigned in the late 8th century, is presented as the true creator of the modern papacy. How could one pope fundamentally transform the institution like that?
Well, Guettée argues that Adrian I, driven by ambitious views for Roman supremacy, couldn't find the necessary historical or traditional documents within the authentic church tradition to back up his claims. So what did he do? According to Guettée's sources, he relied on apocryphal documents written to suit the occasion.
Apocryphal, meaning fake.
Essentially, yes. These were the infamous false decretals, a collection of forged documents composed sometime between 775 and 785 AD. Guettée argues that these forgeries were meticulously crafted to legalize all future usurpations of the Roman See, at a time when Western libraries were in ruins after invasions, and the clergy were often in deepest ignorance, making them susceptible to accepting these fabricated texts as genuine ancient tradition.
That's a staggering claim, that the foundations of modern papal power are built, at least in part, on forgeries. This really changes the narrative.
It absolutely does. For Guettée, this wasn't a natural evolution. It was a conscious, deliberate shift, driven by ambition and facilitated by a widespread lack of historical and theological knowledge in the West at that specific time.
It also makes me wonder, how does this conscious shift contrast with earlier, more respected figures like St. Gregory the Great, who died in the early 7th century? You mentioned him before.
It's a stark contrast, and Guettée emphasizes this heavily. He meticulously shows that Gregory the Great's letters absolutely condemn the modern papacy as it later developed. Gregory strongly rejected the title of universal bishop, seeing it as vainglorious and wicked.
Not just humble, but actually wrong.
Exactly. He wasn't just being humble. He genuinely believed that such a title would diminish the dignity of all other bishops and potentially lead the entire church astray if the universal one should fall into error. For Gregory, ecclesiastical authority resided in the episcopate as a whole, the collective body of bishops, not in one singular bishop.
Right, the collegial model again.
Precisely. He even explicitly states that the single see of the Prince of the Apostles, Peter, now exists in 3 places: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, sharing authority equally through legitimate episcopal succession.
3 places, not just Rome.
Not just Rome. He shared Peter's authority, in a sense, across these key ancient sees. And he famously told Eulogius of Alexandria, "I pray you let me never again hear this word command, for I know who I am and who you are. By your position you are my brethren. By your virtues you are my fathers."
Wow, you are my brethren. That directly answers the question. What was Gregory the Great's view on universal bishoprics? He saw it as blasphemous, an innovation that would undermine the very structure of the church.
Absolutely. A complete rejection of the concept.
So, if a revered figure like Gregory the Great was so vehemently against the concept of a universal bishop, how did Rome actually get there? Beyond the false decretals, was there another catalyst?
Guettée highlights another pivotal moment, showing that imperial politics played a hand in Rome's ambition, kind of giving it an offensive boost. He points to Emperor Phocas, whom Guettée colorfully describes as one of the vilest men.
Doesn't sound like a great endorsement.
Not at all. Phocas, in 6-7 AD, apparently at the request of Pope Boniface III, decreed that the see of the Roman and Apostolic Church should be the chief, caput, of all the churches. Guettée argues this was the official origin of the title being formally granted by secular power.
So an emperor declared Rome the head.
Yes, and its meaning, Guettée emphasizes, quickly shifted. It changed from simply head, or maybe first among equals, to sovereign prince, and then rapidly snowballed into absolute monarch, infallible autocrat. This wasn't a natural development from early church practice, but a usurpation, officially sanctioned by a secular and frankly rather unsavory emperor not rooted in ancient ecclesiastical tradition. This imperial decree was a significant turning point, allowing the papacy to formalize and expand claims it had previously only hinted at or sought through influence.
This raises an important question. Did Rome only assert these claims during times of imperial favor, or did it also perhaps exploit moments of weakness or crisis in the broader church?
Oh, absolutely. Guettée uses the monothelite controversy in the 7th century, the same one involving Pope Honorius, as a prime example of Rome leveraging crises to expand authority. When Eastern patriarchs, like those in Constantinople and Alexandria, fell into heresy or were caught up in political turmoil.
Creating a power vacuum, maybe?
Exactly. Orthodox bishops in the East often appealed to the West, in the person of the Bishop of Rome, to sustain the Catholic faith, seeing him as a bulwark of orthodoxy when their own sees were compromised. Rome skillfully took advantage of these appeals. They started claiming authority by virtue of the power that he had received from St. Peter to appoint vicars in the East, essentially representatives with authority.
Vicars in the East, was that normal?
According to Guettée, it was a step unheard of before and totally outside ancient custom. This shows the clear tendency of Roman bishops, as Guettée puts it, to exaggerate Peter's prerogatives in order to appropriate them and assert a form of universal jurisdiction that had not previously been recognized. They capitalized on chaos and desperation to consolidate and expand their power.
This whole journey through history makes it clear that a growing chasm was developing between East and West. Guettée asserts that this divide, culminating in the Great Schism of 1054, was primarily due to Rome's insistence on its new, absolute, and divinely sanctioned sovereignty, which the East consistently resisted. Let's look at a pivotal moment: the conflict between Pope Nicholas I and Patriarch Photius in the 9th century. This seems to be a real watershed moment.
It truly is. Nicholas I, emboldened by the very false decretals we just discussed, remember, those forgeries were relatively recent then.
Right, giving him supposed ancient backing.
Exactly. He began explicitly stating that without the consent of the Roman See and the Roman Pontiff, nothing should be decided in controversies. He went even further, claiming the princedom of the divine power granted to Peter. In a really shocking move, he even addressed Photius, who was the lawfully consecrated Patriarch of Constantinople, as a simple layman, implying no bishop could truly hold office without Rome's consent.
Calling the Patriarch of Constantinople a layman? That's bold.
It was a direct, autocratic claim that previous popes simply never made, a stark departure from the mutual respect and conciliar decision-making of earlier centuries. It was the papacy stating its perceived divine right to absolute jurisdiction over everyone.
How did Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, react to such unprecedented claims?
He was known as a scholar, right?
Immensely learned. Photius, intimately familiar with ecclesiastical antiquity, was a staunch defender of the ancient order of the Church. He didn't resort to harsh words or personal attacks, but he firmly upheld the principle that one church should not condemn the usages of another, provided they are not contrary either to the faith or to the canons of the general councils. Mutual respect for legitimate diversity.
So he stood his ground on tradition.
He did. He recognized Rome's primacy of honor, its historical importance being the old capital, but he absolutely rejected its newly asserted sovereign authority. Nicholas's response was telling. He disowned his own legates, who had actually acknowledged Photius as patriarch in Constantinople.
He overruled his own representatives. Yes. And then proceeded to pronounce anathema against him, based on his own arbitrary judgment, not any canonical process that would have been recognized as valid in the East. Guettée highlights that Nicholas's claims to divine right were entirely baseless according to ancient tradition, and that his interpretation of Nicaea, that it granted no enlargement to the Roman Church but rather took example from her, was a complete distortion of historical fact and the Council's actual intent.
This dispute over authority seems to have spilled over into other areas, like the Bulgarian jurisdiction dispute. How did that further exemplify Rome's new approach?
The Bulgarian jurisdiction dispute was another major flashpoint, when the newly baptized Bulgarians asked whether to be subject to Rome or Constantinople, a classic geopolitical religious question.
Right, who gets the new converts?
Exactly. The Roman legates claimed the Pope's decision was supreme. However, the Eastern legates, relying on ancient possession, the fact that Greek clergy had been active there for a long time establishing the Church, declared Bulgaria dependent on Constantinople based on traditional boundaries. Rome's reaction was swift and aggressive. Pope Adrian II and later John VIII threatened Ignatius, the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, with excommunication if he didn't withdraw his clergy from Bulgaria, stating flatly that Rome was the source of all true doctrine.
Source of all true doctrine, that's quite a claim.
It was an overt act of asserting absolute sovereign power, claiming direct jurisdiction over another patriarchate based on these newly fabricated claims from the false decretals. It vividly showcases Rome's aggressive pursuit of universal authority in defiance of ancient ecclesiastical boundaries.
What's fascinating here is that even when Pope John VIII appeared to reconcile with Photius later, there were still these underlying tensions, especially on doctrinal matters, weren't there?
Indeed. John VIII did engage in a period of apparent reconciliation with Photius, but as the historian Fleury notes, and Guettée cites, John's letters to Constantinople had to be modified by the council meeting there at Constantinople itself.
The Eastern Council edited the Pope's letters.
Apparently so. The Eastern bishops were weeding out any expressions that claimed the Pope wished to be sovereign of the Church. This demonstrates the Eastern Church's unwavering resistance to these new papal claims, even in moments of attempted peace. They weren't going to accept that language. And on the doctrinal front, John VIII in 879 explicitly condemned those who, in their folly, have had the audacity to act otherwise from the beginning, concerning the addition of the filioque to the creed, calling it blasphemous.
The filioque, that's a pretty technical term for many of our listeners. Can you briefly explain what it means and why it was so contentious? It keeps coming up.
Sure. The Nicene Creed, the foundational statement of Christian faith, accepted pretty much everywhere, traditionally stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The filioque is Latin for "and the Son." It was an addition made gradually in the West, primarily in Spain and Gaul, so the creed read that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son.
Okay, so adding "and the Son." Why was that such a big deal?
It became a huge theological sticking point. The East saw it primarily as an unauthorized alteration of a universal creed established by ecumenical councils. You couldn't just change it locally. They also saw it as a theological innovation that altered the traditional understanding of the Trinity, potentially subordinating the Spirit or confusing the distinct roles of Father and Son. John VIII's condemnation of it in 879 directly contrasts with Pope Nicholas before him, who had approved it.
So popes disagreed on the filioque.
Yes, showing Rome's inconsistent doctrinal position on this key issue when it didn't necessarily serve its immediate ambition for authority. Meanwhile, the East remained consistent in its adherence to the original Nicene Creed, unaltered. Guettée suggests this highlights that doctrinal consistency could sometimes be secondary to the assertion of papal prerogative for Rome during this period.
Okay, fast forward to the 11th century, with figures like Leo IX. The papacy's claims became even more explicit and aggressive, leading directly to the Great Schism in 1054. What was Leo IX asserting at this point that really pushed things over the edge?
In his letters to Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Leo IX laid it all out. He declared the Roman Church to be the head and mother of all churches, the unshaken rock against which the gates of hell shall never prevail. Echoing Matthew 16:18, but applying it exclusively and absolutely to the institution of the Roman See.
Head and mother, unshaken rock.
He claimed it was the divine center, and that no nation which presumes to disagree with her can any longer be regarded as belonging to the Church. This was an absolute claim to universal jurisdiction, and essentially a condemnation of anyone who would dissent from Roman dictates. He even used the forged donation of Constantine, that wholly fabricated document claiming Emperor Constantine had granted vast temporal and spiritual power to the Pope, to assert temporal as well as spiritual power.
Using a known forgery to claim worldly power, too.
Yes, this, Guettée argues, was the papacy sacrificing ancient Catholic doctrine and collegial governance to its ambitious theories, ultimately leading to the final rupture between East and West in 1054 when legates exchanged excommunications.
This raises an important question. How does Guettée's view, as presented throughout his work, contrast with later Roman Catholic doctrines, specifically those defined by Vatican I, or with the theological understanding of Eastern Orthodoxy? Because his arguments sound very critical of the modern papacy.
Well, Guettée's entire work, written in the 19th century before Vatican I concluded, but anticipating its direction, functions as a meticulously researched historical refutation of the doctrines that were later defined by Vatican I, namely papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction.
So he was arguing against them before they were even formally defined?
Effectively, yes, based on the trajectory he saw. He systematically demonstrates their lack of historical basis in the first 8, even 10 centuries of the Church, showing them to be innovations rather than ancient traditions. His arguments align remarkably closely with the theological and historical understanding prevalent in Eastern Orthodox theology, which has consistently denied these later Roman claims and sees them as precisely the innovations that broke the Church's unity.
So Guettée's historical analysis lines up pretty well with the Orthodox perspective on this.
Very much so. The tragic attempts at reunion throughout history, like the Councils of Lyon in the 13th century and Florence in the 15th, failed precisely because, from Guettée's viewpoint, the Orthodox view, Rome demanded submission as the only basis for unity. They were unwilling to have their newly asserted supreme authority or doctrines like the filioque seriously called into question in a truly equal council. Guettée paints a picture where Rome viewed interest, brute force, and threats as acceptable means to achieve what they termed unity, rather than pursuing it through genuine collegial dialogue and adherence to shared ancient traditions. He essentially shows that from the Eastern perspective, which he largely adopts based on his historical findings, the West changed, and the schism was a consequence of those changes initiated by Rome.
So what does this all mean for us today? Guettée's deep dive into these historical sources paints a very, very different picture of the papacy's origins and development than the one many are familiar with. He systematically argues that the papacy, in its modern autocratic form, is a fundamental departure from the ancient and universal doctrine of the first 8 centuries of the Church, evolving from a primacy of honor based on the imperial city to a claim of universal, divinely ordained sovereignty.
Right. And this leads us to a profound conclusion from Guettée's work. If the authority of the Bishop of Rome was originally one of honor and influence, derived from the importance of his see as the imperial capital, and only later became a claim of universal divine right sovereignty through historical shifts, political maneuvering, and even, as he argues, the use of forgeries. What are the implications for understanding Christian unity today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Goethe leaves us with the powerful and perhaps uncomfortable, for some, conclusion that these usurpations by Rome were the first and direct cause of the division between East and West, rather than the fault lying equally or primarily with those in the East who resisted the changes and held fast to the ancient traditions as they understood them.
A truly thought-provoking deep dive into history. It really reminds us of the constant tension between tradition and innovation, and how different interpretations of history can profoundly shape our understanding of foundational institutions like the papacy.
Absolutely. History isn't always a straight line.
Definitely not. So, something for you to mull over or perhaps explore on your own. How does a clearer understanding of these historical developments, as presented by Goethe, change your perspective on debates about religious authority, both then and now, and the paths toward potential unity or perhaps continued division in the Christian world?